This podcast is recorded on the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. We extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples listening today.
Hello and welcome to Give and Toke Cannabis Conversations, the show that aims to elevate the conversation about cannabis to a higher level. I'm your host Paul, and today we welcome David Shoebridge, Greens Senator for New South Wales. Before becoming a federal representative, Mr Shoebridge was a state MP in New South Wales and is a recognised voice for social justice and government accountability. He is the Australian Greens spokesperson for digital rights and IT, justice, defence, and now cannabis legalisation. If you enjoy what you hear on today's show, please make sure you follow or subscribe on your podcast platform of choice. And if you use Apple or Spotify, please be sure to leave a 5-star rating or review. You can stay in the loop with everything that's happening on the show by following us on Instagram at Give and Toke. But for now, please enjoy my conversation with David Shoebridge. Now, you are an incredibly busy person, and just this week I noticed you were working with a cross-party delegation to discuss Julian Assange. You've been such a strong voice for so many issues in Australia, and we're here to talk about cannabis today, but there's a bit of an indication of what's on your plate. What are some of the other things on your plate at the moment?
Well, I'm also the party's defence spokesperson, so we are part of building what I think is a growing national campaign against spending hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars on nuclear submarines and the dangers that AUKUS SSN nuclear submarine program present for Australia. Your viewers may have heard that it's a $368 billion program. The truth is, this is an analysis we've been making more public of late. Turns out, Paul, that $368 billion only gets you the first 5 of the 8 AUKUS subs. That money runs out, the $368 billion runs out in 2055 or so. And there's another 3 subs, another decade of spending to get all 8 subs, all of the 8 AUKUS subs together. So the total cost is actually $500 billion. And when it comes to defence, we've been chasing a report from the National Audit Office about these future frigate program that is quietly working its way through defence. It was originally a $30 billion, but it's now a $45 billion project. And for that, you get 6 boats for $45 billion. And it's been a disaster from day one, that particular project. It's 18 months behind schedule, another $500 million over budget. And we just found out from this report we've been chasing from the Audit Office that they had 3 competing tenders for this Hunter Frigates project, the Future Frigates project. And they kind of forgot to test them for value for money. You said you would test it for value for money, but they kind of forgot. And they just picked one, right? Without testing them against each other for value for money. And you could not make this stuff up.
It's not shocking that people become so disillusioned with politics when you hear those kind of figures being bandied around in the midst of a cost of living crisis. Like just today, I'm trying to work out how to save money on my prescription medication. I'm talking saving $25 a week, and you're talking in the trillions of dollars. And it's kind of tough to hear.
Well, that's why I'm in politics, right? To point out this bullshit and bastardry and to direct this huge amount of funds of our collective wealth to where we absolutely need it. So, I've been in the Senate all week, and we've had Labor furious that we're not agreeing with them to pass a housing package that is largely investing money in the stock market, about $10 billion in the stock market, and hoping that the returns from that, they might be able to build some houses with, right? And they're saying this is, this generational expenditure, $10 billion. It's not being spent on houses, it's being put on the stock market. But anyhow, assume it's a $10 billion package, right? They have lost more money in just mismanaging this one contract on frigates. And they're proposing to spend 50 times that on nuclear submarines, and they have the hide to tell us, and they're doing this all together with the coalition, right, that we are somehow out of order for asking for more money for housing. It's part of our job, part of my job as a Greens senator is to change the expectations of what people should have from politics. You should expect that you'd spend 50 times more on housing than on submarines. That's what we should expect. And that's, I've got to say that's a long-term project in politics, Paul.
I would hope my listeners have seen the Future Fund episode of Utopia, where it just really comes to life. That show has been such an amazing image of what goes on behind the scenes in government. And I think comedy has a great way of doing that, of kind of telling these stories, because I think if it was a documentary or a drama, it would just be incredibly depressing.
There's an extraordinary episode from about 6 years ago of Utopia about the submarines. I put it up, a little extract of it on some of my social media. And look, I won't spoil it for your listeners. Just you get it, look at it, and think, oh my God, they actually did it.
Your profile will be linked down in the show notes so people can go check that out on Instagram, because it's kind of art becoming reality, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. But look, I know we're here to talk about cannabis, and the good news is that that's a multi-billion-dollar good story if we get this right. And I think it's an exciting case of what kind of good change we can make if we get politics to work.
Before we start talking cannabis, I want to talk briefly about your background. I understand that your motivation to join the Greens was based on your connection with nature, noticing of the way the governments at the time responded to the Iraq War and seeing that the Greens were the only ones offering a peace model. And then finally, you were working as a solicitor in industrial law and seeing workers' compensation being stripped. So that was kind of your motivation into the Greens. Something I'm fascinated about is this concept that you've become more radical in politics. So just touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, well, when you lift up the bonnet and you have a look at how it all works, you have a look at how the engine runs underneath, it becomes even more troubling close up. And I suppose I feel really fortunate because I was a Greens state MP for 11 years and now I'm a Greens senator. And I've got a party that wants you to be more courageous and wants you to ask the hard questions. And we don't have a bunch of corporate donors who are saying to us, actually pull back, let that one go. We really want this one to get through. Our voting base is hundreds of thousands of millions of ordinary Australians. And our donations come from small donations from across the country. And it gives us it gives you a kind of, almost like a suit of armor when you go into Parliament, because there's no special interest we're trying to deliver for. And so that lets you sort of chase rabbits down rabbit holes that end up exposing just the appalling waste, the appalling mismanagement, and the real conflicts of interest between government and corporate Australia. And I suppose having the ability to do that has been really liberating. But then I've also been committed to getting out, talking with people on the ground, and a lot of that has been First Nations communities across my home state of New South Wales, and seeing the way in which, say, the police grossly over-police First Nations communities, seeing the way in which traditional services are not going to them and their health, seeing the sort of endemic racism that is applied to First Nations communities, and then going back into a parliament where they're in complete denial about all that stuff. And we have these pressing social needs, whether it's people facing homelessness, First Nations people facing over-policing, people who just can't afford to go to the doctor, people who are turning their heating off because they can't afford the power in winter. We have all these really concrete concerns that are directly being related to me when I'm out in the community. And then I come back into Parliament and I get told we can't afford fixing that. We can't help fixing that, but we've got $5 billion for the police. Or we can't help fix that, but we've got $250 billion we're giving on stage 3 tax cuts. Oh, we can't help that woman down there who can't get her teeth fixed, but we have got $45 billion to spend on Hunter frigates. And I don't know how that couldn't other than radicalise you and make you want to shake the system and break the system and change the system. I think just having the ability to be there with my eyes open without being tied to any vested interests, it is a radicalising process. And I think my politics have definitely firmed up, become more progressive, more probably left. And my sense of betrayal by our current institutions and a commitment to change it, not just to sort of walk away and discuss or feel disempowered, but to actually get in there, engage with the fight, motivate people to change it.
Well, that commitment to change is incredibly admirable and something that I really enjoy as I follow you and the work that you do, because I think often you see the reality of the world we live in, you see the reality of being an adult in Australia, and it can be quite tough. So thank you for that work. And on the note of that social change, there's quite a radical proposition that's come up with this Legalising Cannabis Act 2023. So let's talk about that. I was privileged enough to spend 420 with you talking about this framework. It's a very exciting prospect. So let's talk about the Legalised Cannabis Act 2023. What is it? Why did it come about?
Yeah, well, I suppose it came about from a lot of my state work. I was the police spokesperson and justice spokesperson at a state level in New South Wales. And again, my connection through Young Greens, my connection with people on the ground people kept telling me about just how appalling the drug dog problem was in New South Wales. Police sniffer dogs, stopping them, people getting randomly searched, being humiliated on the streets, people being afraid to go to music festivals because they get strip searched going to a music festival because of a dog's indication. And we started obviously interrogating the police, getting the numbers, getting the data, going out and talking with people. And it became apparent to me that the police drug dog program, the stop and searches, particularly of people of colour, First Nations people, people in poorer communities, so much of that was linked to cannabis. And the police using the suspicion that somebody had cannabis on them in order to stop them, accost them, search them, sometimes strip search them, humiliate them. And often those interactions with police, if they're happening, hundreds of thousands of times a year, and they are in New South Wales on the basis of this, they often escalate into a confrontation with police, and then someone can find themselves having gone from just walking down the street with their mates to suddenly being charged with, resist arrest, offensive language, assault police, and bang, you're actually facing jail time. And so we began and we still do, we have a Facebook page, Instagram page called Sniff Off, where people actually indicate where drug dogs are operating. And they post where the drug dogs are operating. We share it to a larger growing community. And people can avoid getting off at Central Station if the drug dogs are there, because they don't want to be monstered just for being young or having long hair, or, as it turns out, being on the last carriage of the train wearing the wrong tracksuit, which was an indicator police had for stopping and searching people. It
really shows that it's truly a gateway drug, but to the police giving you a hard time.
Yeah, it's a gateway to the criminal justice system. That's what it is, a gateway drug. And, and the more I looked at it, the more I realized that the over-policing of cannabis was just this tool by the police. And then, Parliament was happy to give police the resources and the power to do this. It turns out, when we look at the national data, and it's not just limited to New South Wales, it's across the country, to put 80,000 people a year into the criminal justice system, largely because of cannabis possession. So I worked with my colleagues in a state level to support and bring forward legislation to legalise cannabis. My colleague Kate Fairman, still in the New South Wales Parliament, she brought a bill only last year just after I left Parliament, actually, to legalise cannabis, and she's still committed to that at a state level. So when I came to the federal Parliament, and I've been a senator since July of last year, I thought, well, what can I do on this space federally? And I'm of the belief that actually we're more likely to get reform to legalise cannabis federally because we've got more distance from these really aggressive and empowered police forces and police unions at a federal level than you do at a state level. And so I sat down, I came up with a cunning plan to use the Commonwealth Parliament to legalise cannabis. I'm a barrister and a solicitor before I came into Parliament. My plan was to use the foreign affairs power, the external affairs power, because Australia's entered into a heap of treaties about drugs and drug regulations. And that normally opens the door to allow the Commonwealth to legislate on something. Because most people think that all the cannabis stuff, all the criminalisation and regulation of cannabis needs to happen at a state level, because traditionally that's where it's all happened. New South Wales has a bunch of crap laws, Victoria has a bunch of crap laws, Queensland, etc. They've all got laws criminalising cannabis. And that's traditionally how we've done it in Australia. And then the Commonwealth has kind of only had laws that make it a crime to import or export cannabis. They've got border control. But I thought, well, why don't we just get a federal piece of legislation that in one go legalises cannabis across the whole country? And we come up with a national scheme that would, I think, be the best solution, because we'd have a uniform scheme across the whole country. And also with one piece of legislation and one big push, we can actually, by legalising cannabis federally, you can turn off, basically override all the state and territory laws that try to criminalise it. And so you don't need 6 or 7 fights. You can have one big fight in the one place and legalise cannabis for the whole country. Turns out my cunning plan to use the external affairs power wasn't the best plan, because we got some constitutional advice from one of the most preeminent constitutional lawyers in the country, a guy called Professor Patrick Kaiser. And he says the patents power and these other powers are the powers to use it. He's the guy when it comes to constitutional law. So we've crafted our bill using the patents power to come up with a scheme to legalise cannabis for the whole country, allow people to grow 6 plants at home, but otherwise have a licensed scheme, registered scheme with the new Cannabis Australia National Authority. And we've taken that bill out for its first round of public consultation. That public consultation only ended on the 9th of May, and we've got the initial results in from that. And we plan to then bring it in after we work through that consultation, tidy up a few things in the bill, bring it onto the floor of the Parliament in June, and then take it from there.
So within the bill, there are provisions to specifically exclude big tobacco and big alcohol companies. There are specific provisions that allow the opportunity for cannabis cafes to be open, and also specifics around online sales with them. There are limits on advertising. There's the register of strains. So there's this vision here, basically where consenting adults are able to buy cannabis from people that are licensed to sell it. So how were the specifics of the bill informed?
So we've had a look at, thankfully, we've now seen how the rest of the world's been going in this. We've seen a kind of mixed bunch of options in the United States, but largely a kind of free market, free-for-all in a bunch of states in the United States, and that produces certain outcomes. We've seen the way Canada has worked. We've seen the sort of quasi-legalization in Mexico, and we've seen the kind of more recent experiment in Thailand, which is largely an unregulated market in Thailand as well. And, we've got some longer history of some decriminalisation models like Portugal and but this isn't decriminalisation, this is legalisation we're proposing. Having a look at those, we decided that we wanted to not just legalise cannabis, we wanted to legalise cannabis in a way that didn't have the market completely controlled by a handful of big corporate players. We wanted to get all the benefits of legalising cannabis, get 80,000 people a year out of the criminal justice system, but also create a kind of democratic market to decentralise the power of this and to provide economic benefits and share them across the country and really find what we were hoping, particularly some regional economies, really empower small growers, small players in regional economies, maybe some cooperatives as well, to really deliver some meaningful, properly paid economic opportunities for people across the country. And so that's why we have the prohibition on big alcohol, big tobacco, and big pharma from being in the industry. We actually want to create a new grassroots industry. That's why we want to limit the online advertising, so we don't just have one or two big corporate players and two big warehouses, one in Sydney, one in Melbourne, dominate the whole market. We want to see smaller, not tiny, but small cannabis cafes run by individuals or run by collectives in the form of a cooperative. We want to see them capturing some of the economic benefits and the bulk of the economic benefits, sharing them amongst the community. We want to see small growers being registered and licensed. One of the things I'm particularly, we don't talk about this as a headline measure, but one of the things I particularly like is we allow for the registration of varieties which are based upon strain and genetics. But we also, the wording in the bill is broad enough to allow for the place-based products to be registered. So just like we have champagne, Prosecco, or those kind of regional associations, Burgundy and things for wine, well, we may have, the best North Coast Blue for cannabis as well. And we've consciously tried to create a democratic market, decentralized, empowering democratic market, which I think is an exciting part of the bill, to be honest.
One of the curiosities that has come up for me, because I know it's something you're passionate about, and it's something I learnt during my time in Canada, was First Nations really weren't consulted on the Canadian Cannabis Act. And I do notice there is an absence of that presence in this bill. What are your plans, particularly now post-public consultation, to consider that?
Yeah, well, I'm going to give you this figure that I haven't given it out publicly before. We closed our online consultation on the 9th of May, and we've had 8,916 responses to it, which is pretty extraordinary if you think about it. And they're detailed responses. It took about 10 to 15 minutes to work your way through that survey. And so we've had 8,900 completed responses engaging with the bill. We've also had another sort of more detailed consultation process that we take with a smaller group of stakeholders. But one of the initial feedbacks we've had from that in some of the consultation with stakeholders, and in fact, you raised this as well with me, Paul, down in the 420 discussion, but we've had it also in the responses that have come on online, the opportunity to create an element of this market for First Nations communities, find a way to have an empowering of First Nations communities. And it may be, and we haven't fully assessed, obviously, 8,900 responses, we haven't fully assessed them yet, but it may be that some of that regional nomenclature kind of capacity may come with a requirement of engagement with an empowerment of First Nations communities in that space. Like, you can't register a regional variety unless you're doing it cooperatively with traditional owners in that space and they're getting a share of the economic benefits. That's one of the options that has that we're workshopping actually in the last week in the office.
I know the British Columbian government are trying to kind of counteract the lack of representation in the Federal Act by bringing in things like exclusive licenses for farm-to-table operations, exclusive licenses for particular locations. So it's great to see that these considerations are being made, because there's kind of cultural, historical and agricultural things to lean on, but then also empowerment things to lean on. So I'm really glad to hear that that's becoming an important part of it.
And there's a sense of historical corrective here too, by the way, because First Nations people have been overrepresented in the ugly, aggressive over-policing of cannabis. So actually creating an historical corrective in a bill that we bring forward, there's a sense of, the curve of justice bending slowly in that space, isn't there?
Something I'm not kind of as fearful of as other kind of dedicated cannabis users is the idea that legalization will bring this big industry and it'll no longer kind of be ours to hold. Like, I want my 74-year-old mum to be able to walk into a shop, get a CBD roll on. She doesn't need to go to the guy down the street. It's just not as kind of dignified as a legal operation. But there's a lot of people who cling to decriminalisation as a way of avoiding big government. So the bill aims to add this Cannabis Australia National Agency. What would you say to those people who are scared that this is kind of a big government oversight coming into their precious plant?
Well, I would say people to read the bill and have a look at what the job of Canna is. It's really kind of it's a registration body. It's a registration and licensing body. Its job isn't going to be the big central wholesaler and retailer. Its job is really to set the ground rules for licenses. And so, for example, one of the things we're requiring in the bill is if you get a license for the retail or selling of cannabis, that you need to have a responsible service of cannabis qualification. And it'll be Canna's job to set the minimum standards for those qualifications, to police those qualifications and to ensure that people have them. It'll be Canna's job also to oversight the online advertising and sales. And this is an area that of just my initial review of the surveys shows that there is heated discussion and contest about should there be limitations on online sales or not. Our rationale for saying we want some limitations on online sales is primarily around this idea of a decentralized market. What we want to have is each cannabis cafes will operate within a locality, maybe a local government area, or maybe if it's in part of regional and rural parts of Australia, maybe it's a broader area, but they'll have a geographical remit. They'll be able to advertise online and deliver cannabis through an online portal within their geographical remit. And we see that as a way of, first of all, encouraging local growers and a local industry and providing a greater economic opportunity for regional cannabis cafes and retailers and preventing one or two big players from dominating the whole market. And so Canna would have the job of ensuring that the online sales are being made in accordance with those geographical restrictions. And so they'd have to have some oversight of, being able to go and have a look at your records and see where the sales happens. But we also want to we don't want to be the fun police. And so we haven't put a whole bunch of artificial restrictions on point of sale advertising. We actually want there to be innovation and diversity. We want new products to be able to be tested. And actually that's a kind of exciting thing about creating a legal cannabis market. You can get the innovation, you can get the investment, you can have new products for sale. And and interestingly, the most common way in which people want to consume cannabis, according to the survey, is actually in edibles. And so allow an exciting, fun, edgy edibles market to be created. We'd like that as a core outcome from the bill. Because as I said, we want to be sensible about it. We want to stop it getting in the hands of kids. We want to regulate so people know what they're buying, but we do not want to be the fun police.
So one of the things that has come up in Germany's legalization plan is a cap on THC limits. Is there any desire or intention to do that at any stage? And if so, what informs that discussion?
Well, we haven't put any limitation in the bill. We do give the national authority the ability to, when it's a fairly broad capacity to issue licenses, there could potentially be the capacity for the licenses to have restrictions on the strength of the amount of THC in cannabis that's been supplied. But we don't think it would be at all sensible to have a legislative provision in that, because this is an area where the science is still well out about what levels are or aren't acceptable. A number of submissions have suggested that we might expressly include the capacity to have lower THC levels for people under the age of 21 because of evidence about THC and people's developing brains, particularly young males. And that's something I'm not ruling in or ruling out until I go through all the survey responses. But I think fundamentally, one of the things this bill will provide is truth in labelling. If you are informed about THC, if you know what kind of levels of THC you would like to have in your product, for the first time ever, if we legalise it, what's on the packet, what's on the label will actually be true, and it will tell you actually the level of THC in the product that you're consuming. And I think that is an extraordinary step forward for public health and for people's autonomy.
I know when I worked as a bud tender in Canada, I would have very rigorous conversations with people about that very fact, because people would come in thinking about their kind of black market, grey market experience with classic BC bud. They'd come in and they'd see these giant plastic containers, which, there's still a bit of work to go in that department. It does create a lot of waste. But there is something so special about being able to know what that strain is, to know what the percentage is, potentially even know what the terpenes are. The way that informs a new user or a skeptical user or someone who is afraid is really, really important. So a lot of kind of old school people will say, no, I don't need to know. I don't want to know what's percentage anyway. That's a new thing. But for younger and newer consumers, it's so important.
Yeah. And that experience you're reflecting back to me is the experience I've had talking with people about consulting on the bill, their experience of being in Canada or Colorado and actually walking into like a shop which feels pretty chilled out, but dealing with, say, a bud master or a salesperson who knows what they're talking about, tells you about the different strains, says, well, actually, what are you looking for? Is this sort of bit you want to chill out after work, going to go out with some friends? Tell me what you're after, and we'll talk through the different products. And the kind of power that gives you as a consumer and the knowledge that gives you as a consumer, I think is, a really important outcome from legalizing cannabis. And, maybe some people don't want to do that. Maybe they want to just go and get a lucky dip or something. They're welcome to that. But I think particularly young people, they want to know what they're putting in their body. They want to be able to make informed choices about what they're putting in their body. And the way we can do that with cannabis is we legalize it.
Absolutely. Well, you know that you've got a supporter in me, and this is such an incredible bill, and I'm really excited to see what comes from it. We might have time to squeeze in a couple more questions, but I want to change gears a little bit here, and I'm hoping that you're up for playing a bit of a quiz. This is a classic feature of Give and Tote Cannabis Conversations, the quiz, and I'm hoping that we can play Politicians Behaving Badly Part 2. Part 1 was in my conversation with Fiona Patton. It went down a treat. So, David, are you up for playing a little game right now?
Yeah, go for your life, Paul.
Excellent. All right. They all pertain to Australian political scandals, so let's do this. Question 1. In 2015, Speaker of the House of Representatives Bronwyn Bishop chartered a private helicopter for an event that was an 80-kilometre drive away. How much did the taxpayer spend on Miss Bishop's charter? Was it $2,000, $3,500, or $5,000?
I'm going to go with $5,000, but I remember it was Choppergate, if I remember.
That is correct.
Yes, $5,227 on a helicopter that she had to take.
I haven't chartered a helicopter yet for my work, particularly to go 80 k's down the road.
Yet is the key word there. Question 2. In 2016, Peter Dutton accidentally texted Samantha Maiden, a journalist who had been critical of his government, calling her a mad effin' what? Cow? Witch? Or plain and simple, mad effin' woman?
I remember being deeply offended when I saw what had happened, but I can't for the life of me remember the nature of the insult. I think it might have been the first one.
Denied.
Yeah, I think it might have been in the context of all of that, those other appalling attacks that had happened on a former Prime Minister as well.
Unfortunately, you got that one incorrect, but it was the mad effing witch, which, definitely links to that Julia Gillard ditch the witch stuff. Yeah. So
ugly misogyny in politics. It really, it turns people off politics. But can I say this? The new parliament that we've got elected since 1 July, the influx, particularly of new women in there, the teals coming in, I'm not saying it's gone, but everybody I talk to say that the parliament that we currently have is a bloody sight different for the one that preceded us. And And so things can change. I'm not saying it's perfect, it's a very long way from perfect. But that kind of open misogyny is now called out and spotted and named for what it is. I'm not saying every time either, but people voted for some change and they got a bit of it.
It is vindicating hearing that, because I do feel like we were kind of gaslit for, the better part of a decade, thinking that is all completely normal. So that is promising. Question 3, and this is an open answer question, so I'm not going to give you any options here. Sir Billy Snedden served as the leader of the Liberal Party in the 1970s and died in controversial fashion at a Travelodge in Sydney in 1987. What were the strange circumstances of Sir Billy's death?
My memory of Sir Billy was he was notorious for having an affair, a highly politically damaging affair.
That is correct.
I'm going to pay that, because it was indeed an affair. The strange circumstance of it was that he was sleeping with one of his son's exes whilst he was having that affair. So, real stand-up guy there, conservative family values.
Yeah, the level of betrayal, the layers of betrayal that particular event has.
Question 4. In 2014, then New South Wales Premier Barry O'Farrell resigned after it was discovered that he had not disclosed the gift of a bottle of Grange Hermitage from a prolific political donor. At $3,000 a bottle, what was the vintage? 1959, 1960, or 1961?
I was in state politics at the time, and we were referring the matter off to ICAC. I was deeply involved in addressing that corruption scandal, but bloody hell, I can't remember the vintage. I do remember him coming back, though. He denied that he'd ever received the bottle of Grange until the next day they showed him his thank you card that he sent to the owner and said, "Thanks very much for that bottle of Grange." He's now the High Commissioner for Australia in India, so it worked out all right for Barry. I think it was 1961.
Denied.
So the answer is actually 1959, which he wrote on the thank you card. What a great year. Right after pulling the ICAC classic, I don't recall.
I should have been my answer. I don't recall. That would have been...
That is correct.
I'm giving you a correct answer for that one. All right, in 2023, then New South Wales Premier Dominic Perrottet revealed he had worn a Nazi uniform at his 21st birthday. Newspoll conducted a pre-election poll and found that what percentage of New South Welshmen were now more likely to vote for the coalition as a result of the Nazi uniform? 4%, 6%, or 8%?
Well, because I am a New South Wales MP and I have faith in the people of New South Wales, I'm going to say 4%.
Denied.
Ever the optimist, it was unfortunately 8% of New South Welshmen polled were now more likely to vote for the coalition because of the Nazi uniform. So I like your optimism there, but reality kicks us in the face.
Can I tell you, we're doing this on the day that Elon Musk sent out this appalling tweet this morning our time. I don't know what time it was in Elon's world, where he was seeking to cast doubt about whether or not this appalling individual who's just done the mass killing in Texas, and tragically, there are so many mass shootings in the United States, it's hard to remember which one, but this appalling mass shooting in Texas, the man was covered in swastikas and SS tattoos and had a long history of Nazi affiliation. And Elon Musk today put out a tweet suggesting that all of that evidence that had been presented by the police and the authorities was all part of a psyops operation and a false flag operation and trying to cast doubt on it. And I've got to tell you, that kind of appalling behaviour by people with authority and people, who have an audience creates the kind of shit results you referred to in that survey. And, I think our collective job, whether we're politicians or people doing podcasts or someone just talking with your friends at work, is to call out that crap every time you see it. It's dangerous. It causes harm. In the case of Texas, it saw people being killed. We have an obligation to call it out. Now, whatever Dominic Perrottet did when he was 21, I'm sure he regrets now. But it was clearly wrong 20 years ago when Dominic Perrottet was 21 as well, to be wearing a Nazi uniform. We should call it out whenever we see it.
We're going to finish it with a bonus question here, David. In 2019, Radical Greens MP David Shoebridge was arrested outside of Kirribilli House. He was later cleared of all charges, but what was he arrested for? Was it public urination, drunken disorderly, or disobeying a police directive?
Drunken disorderly would be more colourful. But my memory is I was charged with your failure to comply with a police move-on order. And they threw everything at it and they lost in court. So that was a happy day. Yeah.
Nah, very glad you got out of that one. What were the circumstances of that? Just explain that briefly.
Yeah, when police, the police were trying to arrest and move on a bunch of school kids who were making a climate protest out the front of Kirribilli House. The police were so angry because the kids were blocking a cul-de-sac. And I spoke with the kids before, and they all said that they didn't want to get arrested and they didn't want to create a scene. If it came to a move on order, they wanted everybody to move on. So I said, okay, then you just listen to the kids, right? And I took their direction from them. So when the police surrounded me and gave me a move on order, I said yes, and then they arrested me. So I thought I had a pretty strong defence. It turns out the magistrate agreed.
Well, that brings us to the end of our quiz. Thank you so much for playing Politicians Behaving Badly, Part 2. David, I'm so incredibly grateful for your time today, your passion, your knowledge. This bill is incredibly exciting. Just in a nutshell, what's next? So now that the consultation has closed, now that people's input has been had, what's next on the table?
Well, we're going to go through the submissions we've got, and we will be making amendments to the draft that we put out for consultation that we think will take us through to mid-June. It'll take about that time to go through the submissions and, work with parliamentary drafters and change the bill. Our plan is then to introduce the bill in mid to late June and then refer it off for an inquiry, a Senate inquiry, which I hope to take around the country, to hear from people all around the country about whether they agree or disagree with this bill to legalise cannabis, whether they want to have $28 billion in public revenue in the next 10 years that could buy half a sub or do a whole lot of other good. Then when we finish that inquiry, we write up the report, we bring it onto a vote early next year, and hopefully by then we've got a couple of million people behind us and we legalise cannabis.
Amazing. You're a prolific social media user. Your content is fantastic. Where can our listeners find you?
Well, you can follow me on Twitter, on Instagram or Facebook. And, if anyone has a question that they want to take up directly with us, we endeavour to respond to all of the inquiries that we get by email as well. So you can Google my Senate email. And in fact, because I'm a Greens MP and I don't believe that the Chinese Communist Party is trying to take over the country through TikTok, you can also find me on TikTok.
All of those will be linked in the show notes. David Shoebridge, you are an asset to Australia. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, cheers, Paul. And we're happy to connect again in a couple of months' time when we're a bit further down the track.
I'd love that. Excellent. All right, you take care, David. Thank you so much.
Cheers, Paul. I've enjoyed it.
Give and Toke Cannabis Conversations is written and produced by me, Paul. Music written and produced by Big Mike. Follow us on Instagram at Give and Toke or get in touch by emailing giveandtoke@gmail.com. You'll also find us on both Twitter and Facebook. All opinions expressed by program guests are solely their current opinions and do not necessarily reflect the position of Give and Toke. Content discussed in this show does not constitute medical advice. Cannabis is not legal everywhere, so please be aware of local laws.